Frank, the world has changed a lot since we saw you last. We're in the midst of this COVID-19 global pandemic. I suppose, Frank, just from to begin with, just to ask how the agricultural sector is holding up there in the US. Obviously, we're seeing some very worrying sights of milk being dumped, and the impact on the dairy sector there. So what's it like on the ground?
So the situation is very serious. I think the situation is serious globally, but in the United States as well. And one of the reasons is that many of the outlets that normally sell agricultural products are currently closed. So, for example, schools are closed, and that means no more school milk goes into the supply chain. Restaurants are closed. Cheeses and meats and so on are not sold there, obviously. So, on the one hand, we see an interesting trend, an encouraging trend, and that is that animal source foods in the supermarkets are flying off the shelf. And the supermarkets are having a hard time keeping them stocked because they are in such high demand. So, eggs and milk and meat are very highly sought after. And what's interesting, many of the plant based alternatives that were touted as the great alternative just a few months ago, they are lavishing on the shelves. So that to me is interesting when I go shopping. Now, but overall, the demand is there, but people cannot purchase the way they used to. So you can't just go and order a pizza. And for example, pizzas were a major place for our cheeses. And now that whole production is gone. Look at French fries, or you call them chips, I think. Um, there is really no place to buy chips these days. You cannot go to a fast food chain, you cannot go to a restaurant. So the potato farmers are in severe trouble because of that. So yeah, it's affecting agriculture and it's affecting it severely, not just here but throughout the world.
What about on the dairy side there, in particular, Frank, and these videos that we're seeing, and dairy's obviously big there in your own state, California.
So in those states where the majority of dairy goes into fluid milk, farmers are in trouble, I would say, because there's just no place to send that fluid milk. In places where milk is made into powder or into cheese, the trouble is much less. So Wisconsin is heavy hit. California not so much. We are not dumping milk here in California, but there are some states where that's happening now, and that's just heartbreaking.
Frank, I suppose the main reason we wanted to talk to you as well today is farmers are asking a lot about the impact of this situation, the impact of the economic upheaval of COVID-19 on carbon emissions across the globe. Um, and obviously in Ireland, we won't be able to assess those figures until next year. The EPA say that the 2020 figures won't be out till 2021, where we can see what's actually happening in this window. But you're the expert, Frank. What's happening globally with emissions right now?
So many farmers see those satellite images that go around the world social media right now of northern Italy or China before and after the crisis hit. And what's very clear is that many different air pollutants have gone drastically down, have gone drastically down. But the emissions that are going down are mainly associated with the use of fossil fuel, the burning of oil, coal, and gas. So what's going down are so-called oxides of nitrogen or NOx. Other gases such as volatile organic compounds are going down. There are certain gases that go down, but these gases are mainly associated with the burning of gasoline, the burning of oil, the burning of coal, because these activities have gone down drastically. Much less vehicle traffic on the streets. Anything that uses fossil fuel has gone down drastically. Much fewer air traffic and so forth. Agriculture overall is pretty much maintaining its emission levels because all the activities are maintained. So it's not that your Irish farmers or ours here in California are now doing half as much as before. We're going full throttle. And as a result, our emissions are the same as they were before the pandemic broke. So what is happening is that overall emissions are going down from all of those sectors of society that have always used fossil fuel at large amounts. Agriculture is pretty much the same.
What does that say, Frank, about where agriculture sits? And I know obviously you're very passionate about highlighting that agriculture isn't the culprit that maybe a lot of countries think it is. But what conclusions can be drawn from this in terms of where agriculture sits in the big challenge of reducing carbon emissions?
Well, you've heard me say that before. I think that agriculture plays a very important role in and around greenhouse gases. And I think that role is oftentimes not appreciated, namely that agriculture is not just a source, but agriculture is also a significant sink of greenhouse gases. You now hear some countries in the world proposing that agricultural land be converted into forest. Um, I'm skeptical of that because our grazing lands sequester a lot of carbon and they do this instantaneously, whereas forests that you now plant will sequester carbon in a long time from now. And we need impacts now and not in 10, 20, 30 years. And so I think that farmers do need to get appreciation for the sequestration, assimilation of carbon um, that they are currently already conducting, and that I don't see happening at the extent that I think is needed.
I suppose another side to the argument as well is that agriculture has been permitted to continue, operations here in Ireland and across the EU and globally because it's the food producer. And in this global pandemic, we still need food. So it really highlights the importance, I suppose, of agriculture as a sector as well, and kind of hammers that message home for a lot of the general public.
Look, I live here in California, and that's the agriculture powerhouse of the United States. I now go into the supermarket, and all of a sudden I see there are food shortages. There are certain food items you just don't get anymore. And it really emphasizes the importance of food security. Be careful what you mess with when outlawing agricultural practices, getting rid of agricultural sectors, and so on, or proposing to replace agriculture with other forms of land use, because you might still live in the days before this pandemic hit. But watch carefully what's happening in your supermarkets, what's happening to supply chains, what's happening to farmers, many of whom are quite discouraged and actually contemplate leaving the sector. We do not want that to happen. We need farming. Farming is the most important, the most strategically important sector of our society next to the health sector. We need to foster it, we need to support it any way we can.
Frank, just on back to the emission side of it, Frank. Often when there is a recession, there's talk about the dip in emissions. We had it in the last global recession, where the global carbon emissions went down 2008, 2009, but they actually rose again quite fast after that. So, what about the rebound rate on this? Will there be a lasting impact of the dip in emissions here in terms of will it affect current policies that are in place? Will we have to change policies, or will the rebound effect be quite fast and will we get back to those levels that we were at pre-COVID-19 relatively quickly?
Well, great question, Clara. I don't think that there's any question that the effects that we are seeing now will be very short time in nature, unless the pandemic really stays with us for years, which is currently not what most experts predict. Um, the reductions that we have seen so far will be compensated by increased activities after we are let out of our houses again. The second that people tell us we can now go back to life as we knew it, people will travel the same way they did before. They will drive and fly and do everything they have done in the past, and maybe even more in order to compensate for what they just uh, didn't do over the last few months. And so it's very, very unlikely that the current reductions in emissions that we see, which we all appreciate, of course, that they will last. It's very, very unlikely.
So unlikely to have any sort of impact on policies that are there at the moment.
I cannot imagine that. I cannot imagine that what we are seeing currently will have impacts on policies.
While this is all happening, the climate change issue actually has kind of, gone off the table, gone off the centerfold at the moment. Do you anticipate that once COVID-19 passes, that the focus will return to climate change, climate action, getting emissions down?
I think the world will change. I really do think the world will change. The this shock that has occurred in this context here has been profound. People, for the first time, had to wonder where their food comes from and whether or not they will have enough food in the years to come, in the months to come, in the weeks to come. Um, we have been worrying about items, food items, and other items that we have never, you and I, never worried about in the past. So all of a sudden, we are seeing that, and we are being told where our food comes from. Okay, so if you go into a British supermarket, you need to know about what 60% or so of what's in that supermarket has not been grown in this country, and but is imported from other places. So the self-reliance of food items of a society is actually very important. It's very important that we can produce the food needed by the people who demand it. It's very important. And the thought that we can just get whatever we want by ordering it from wherever in the world, I think that thought will probably subside. I think people will understand more that what they have with respect to food production in their respective countries is something of strategic importance.
Great, Frank. Look, we'll leave it there, Frank. Thank you very much for joining us, and stay safe and well over there, and hopefully we'll have you back in Ireland soon.
I would love to. All my best to you, and see you next time.
Joe, thanks very much for joining us. Joe, like ourselves, the EU is in the grips of this major crisis. It's having a big impact on our exports. Beef prices here are going down as a result. Just how difficult is the market situation at the moment, and can we bounce back from this?
The COVID pandemic is having a number of different impacts, but mainly the overall sales of beef across all our major markets are going to be down. So the net effect of it is going to be some additional storage or overhang of even frozen beef on the market around Europe. That's not just here in Ireland, but there will be more beef retained, obviously, in our major export markets as well too, which will have to come back out onto the market again at some stage, particularly in the case of the steak cuts, because restaurants are no longer open and people are not in general as keen to cook steaks of beef themselves at home as they would be to order steaks in a restaurant. Albeit that Borbia has promotional activities. For example, here in the home market, we now have a TV advertising campaign focusing on the steak cuts in order to encourage more shoppers to buy steaks here in Ireland. And a lot of the retailers even have their own promotions as well too around steak at the moment in order to encourage and hopefully see a bit of an uplift in sales. But of course, we do have to export 90% or thereabouts of the beef that we produce. We do have activity as well, including in Italy at the moment, mainly through the butcher channel, believe it or not, at the moment, where we've seen a very strong increase in the volume of Irish beef steak cuts being sold through a number of outlets there, focusing on Italian butchers. So that has taken a little bit of maybe the pressure off maybe in the last week or two, but unfortunately the issue still remains that there will be an impact of this even going on after the maybe movement restrictions are lifted, whereby there'll be some additional stock remaining on the market. And secondly, the demand will continue to be impacted by the economic situation in our major markets. You know, because unemployment is going to be up, because people's disposable income isn't going to be as high maybe as it was prior to the pandemic, these are all things that are going to impact, unfortunately, on beef demand and lamb demand as well too, because these are among the highest priced proteins. They're in comparison with whether it be chicken breasts or sausages or even eggs, which we are seeing even higher uplifts in retail sales of. It is going to unfortunately see some, I suppose, lulls in terms of demand, even over the months ahead.
Joe, what about the economic impact of this in terms of consumer consumption habits? Do you see a decline in our meat consumption habits, which have been dipping slightly in the EU in recent years?
I suppose the economic impact of it is likely to be, reasonably significant, Claire, given that right across Europe we're seeing unemployment rates increasing, hopefully temporarily, that after the restrictions people will be able to go back into their normal workplace. But we have seen, as you touched on there, a gradual, slow, slight decline. We're only talking about numbers in the very low percentage, single-digit figures, 1-2% per year in terms of reductions in overall beef consumption in general across the EU. So it's not something that is very significant as a trend or very worrying. In a lot of markets, you also have a trend where people are trying to maybe eat a little bit less but better quality. For example, in Germany, and that has even worked in our favour in some markets because Irish beef is seen very much as a high quality product. Also, exports outside of the European Union are going to become an increasing focus as well, including the Chinese market. We've all heard a lot about that in the last 12 months. And it looks as though it is, the first market really to start to recover in terms of post-COVID. The market over there is starting to reopen, and restaurants are opening up. The majority of businesses are operating now again over there, and workers are returning to their employment. So that's very positive. That the numbers of cases obviously are falling, and we're seeing a significant recovery there. And the other factor as well too is the majority of Irish beef that goes into China and other international markets, it travels there in frozen form on large, what we call reefer containers. And while these were in short supply during COVID and really as a result of the impact on logistics, thankfully the chain is starting to move again, and these containers hopefully over the coming weeks and months will become more readily available in order that the industry will be able to again send bigger volumes of product out to the likes of China, where demand is recovering, and we're actually seeing some orders coming in again for Irish beef out there, as was the case 1 or 2 months ago before this pandemic really hit that market.
Joe, we had some positive news this week with confirmation of a contract for 12,000 bulls and steers to go to Algeria. When will the first boat go?
Okay, so I was just speaking to some of the operators involved in that trade, Claire, and it's expected that the first shipment will travel there next week of finished cattle that are going to be processed there. Ramadan is coming up, obviously a huge festival, and it's the main, I suppose, period of the year when consumption rates increase right across the Middle East and right across the Muslim world. It's not just because they fast during the day and tend to eat well then in the evening time with their families, but also some of it is related to being charitable as well too, and sharing their food and their belongings as well too with neighbours and friends. And that's also why the consumption rates increased during the Ramadan festival. And this is part of the reason for the timing of this shipment over the coming weeks. So yeah, a positive development. It's a reflection as well too of the investment that Ireland collectively has put into this market through the Department of Agriculture, through several visits there as well too, in conjunction with Bord Bia's own team as well too, in the African continent, and the demand there appears to be solid and robust at the moment, leading to this significant demand. They also are supplied with animals from Spain and from France, but So far, Ireland has only sent a very small number of animals there, just in November of last year. But they look set to import, as I say, a large consignment here, beginning with the export next week. And they really want to try out the Irish cattle and to I suppose do a trial on them and see how they perform and see how they do in comparison with their other sources. So it is one boatload that is scheduled to arrive, I think, next Monday for loading in Cork. So that is a consignment of almost 2,000, I think, is the capacity of that boat.
Finally, our calf exports. How have they been holding up this season, and has demand been impacted by COVID-19?
So yeah, it's been an interesting season so far, Claire. Obviously, we're in the peak availability of calves at the moment, given that it's a seasonal supply, and calves generally travel when they're 2 or 3 weeks old to our export markets. It started off somewhat suppressed because of weather-related difficulties, and some sailing, in fact, quite a lot of sailings were cancelled during the month of February and early March, just as a result of the rough sea conditions. Then when in the last few weeks conditions improved, certainly our capacity increased. We were even, our ability maybe to export bigger numbers also improved as a result of one of the lairages in Cherbourg expanding its facility there. So in recent weeks, we've seen shipments of 15,000 calves a week being achieved. However, just in the last week or two, that has slowed down. And that is also partly as a result of the COVID impact in some of our major markets. For example, in the Dutch market, the veal industry there is very highly reliant on the food service market around Europe. Veal tends to be sold to restaurants in Italy, in France, in Germany. And as a result of the closure of those outlets, they're experiencing a big decline in demand for veal. So that has had a knock-on impact then on their actual demand for young calves, even though the calves are fed there for a period of 7 or 8 months. When you have problems at the far end of the chain, obviously that is pushed down to their actual demand for their young calf, their raw material, if you like, which have suffered declines in price over the last few weeks of 20 to 30 euro per calf. Our other major outlet for calves is in Spain, and similarly their I suppose beef market, their trade for finished bulls has declined somewhat, and this comes as a result of obviously a decline in food service sales, but also they would anticipate that their tourism market is going to be impacted as a result of this down in Spain and Portugal. So that will also translate into somewhat suppressed beef demand. So as a result of that, on average, cattle prices, not just here in Ireland, but right across our major markets around Europe, have all declined. And this is particularly the case for cull cows. You mentioned, Claire, that prime cattle have declined in price by 20 to 25 cents a kilo over the last few weeks. If you look at cull cows, they have even suffered declines of up to 50 cents a kilo. So very, very significant. And mainly as a result of the loss of, your burger manufacturing channels and indeed your food service outlets.
Thanks very much, Joe. We'll leave it there.